look at the detail in the R3. For those of you that are thinking you could change from your R3 to an R5 Mark II, there is still a noise penalty for getting those extra megapixels and that cropping ability. It's not free. Hey guys, Justin here from the Camera Life, and today I am testing the high ISO capabilities of the new Canon R5 Mark II. This isn't going to be a super fancy test. It's going to be a pretty basic but real world test. I'm going to take some shots of my Rodecaster Pro 2 podcasting setup with some other things around it as a bit of a test scene. Quite low light, and I'm going to compare the results to the R3 and to the original R5. Now, what I'm interested in is, I know that the R3 is going to be better in low light, but what about real world results when you scale the R5 Mark II's high-res images down to the size of the R3? Is there a big difference? Can the R5 Mark II replace my R3 for higher ISO action shooting? And just in general, what are we thinking? High megapixel sensor or lower megapixel, better low light? What is going to be the best camera for most people going forward? Let's test it out. All right, so the reason I thought of this test setup was because I actually need to grab a couple of photos today of my sort of a bit of a podcasting setup for our podcast, live podcast on the Camera Life each week. And so I thought, what a good way to first do a bit of testing, and then secondly, just get a few shots that I can use for promo. So this is my weird little test scene. We've got mouse on a mouse pad. We've got the remote for my dodgy lights for the background of my podcast setup, but it's got some colors on it which could be useful. Got a Mac keyboard, Rodecaster Pro, which is black. I think this will be really handy. Got some light shining through it that'll probably blow out, but the black will show a lot of noise up. We've got the Canon R5 Mark II custom camera strap that we made for the release in Australia, and the Lucky Straps box with our new holographic sticker. See if we get some noise around that. And then we've got the plate that we used to print this strap over this side, and some of Rode's awesome podcasting headphones. So I'm going to start with the R5 original, and what I'm going to do is try to expose a little bit on the darker side, and then we can bring things up in Lightroom. It's a pretty common way of shooting these days, you know, preserve the highlights. So for this Rodecaster Pro, if I was to bump the exposure up to get detail in the shadows, as you can see, we're losing the color in all of the LED lights. So what I'm going to do instead is kind of expose for the LEDs, and then we'll put these into Lightroom and bring them up a little bit. I am going to post JPEGs after I take some of the shots, but towards the end of this video, I'll put all the RAWs into Lightroom. We'll have a look at the noise in some of the files and see what it looks like. As I said, this is not scientific. This is kind of, I mean, it's not real world either. I don't do a lot of shooting like this anyway, but this is more like, I'm not going to do every single ISO from 100 all the way up. What I'm really interested in is 800, 1600, 3200, 6400, 12,800. They're the things that I often work in, primarily 800, 1600, 3200. I do a lot of shooting for sports, so I'd really like to see how they're going to work. And then 6400, 12,800, I do need to use sometimes. They need to be usable, so I really want to compare them to the R3 and see how it goes. All right, let's less yakking, more shooting. So I'm going to set my base exposure level, just so you know. Also lighting the scenes with these Godox TL G30 LED light tubes, one each side, just kind of crossing over. Really pretty average quality of light in terms of I could light the scene up way better, but the idea is, like, this is supposed to be a poorly lit scene to test high ISO. It's not really worth lighting a great scene and then just using high shutter speeds to test high ISO. I don't think it gives you real world results. So I wanted this to be kind of poorly lit. All right, let's go. So we're at an 80th, f5.6,
ISO 800. I'll take that shot. And then we'll bump it up full stop of ISO to 1600. And then also take it up to 160 and leave the aperture the same. Take that shot. 3200 and 3/20th. 6400, 12,800, and just for fun, 25,600. Okay, a little bit higher. We'll do 25,600. We'll expose that a bit brighter, and we'll just do that as one last comparison for ultra high ISO. Let's swap over to the R5 Mark II. Testing out also the 14 to 35 f4 that I loaned through Canon Professional Services. They don't know that I'm making this video with it, or any videos. But yeah, I really like this lens. It's very lightweight. Okay, R5 Mark II, starting off at ISO 800, 80th, 5.6. Let's do it. 6400, 12,800, and 25,600. A higher exposure at 25,600. You guys sticking with me? Super exciting video, I know, right? But we will dig into the RAWs after I've shot this. You can skip forward if you want. That's totally fine. All right, we've got the R3 all mounted up. All right, we've got the R3 all set up. I've also obviously turned off noise reduction on everything. The JPEGs are just set to a standard, I think they're set to landscape mode with no noise reduction, no lighting optimizer, nothing like that. Try and get it as sort of simple as we can. I'm going to run through the same set of images as I did with the last two cameras. If this is the first time you've watched one of these videos, I've been testing the R5 autofocus, the R5 Mark II, that is. I tested it mountain biking and also the eye autofocus yesterday in a portrait style shoot, which was super fun. Go and check those out. And otherwise, I've been doing a video a day, challenging myself to get out and shoot more often. So strolling around town, trying to do whatever I can do, street photography or stuff like that. Things that I don't normally shoot as a professional photographer. And it's been really fun. And this is day 25 of those videos. So one of these shots, I will post the unedited JPEG later today. That's what I've been doing each day. And it's really been pushing me to be a bit more creative and get out and enjoy shooting. All right, that's the full set of images. We'll jump into Lightroom, check them out, check out what the noise is like, and then I'm going to tweak this setup to be a little bit more aesthetically pleasing and a little bit less of a test scene, and I'll take my podcast promo photo that I need to get, which will be my photo for day 25. Just importing the photos into Lightroom now. I'm going to record my screen and chat to you guys while we have a look through the RAWs together and see how this stuff turns out. What do you think? Is it going to be the R3 that's better or the new R5 Mark II? Which camera are you going to buy? Or are you sticking with the original R5 for now and waiting for another upgrade in the future? Where are you at? Comment below.
Okay, so here we are in Lightroom. This is the R5 Mark II. As you guys can see up here in the corner, it tells you the camera, what ISO we've got it set at, etc. Now, I'm going to apply the same basic corrections across all of these images. The reason I'm going to do that and not leave them as they are is, as I said, I want to boost the shadows a bit because it's a really common thing to shoot. Preserve your highlights, which we've got in these colorful pads on the Rodecaster Pro 2. So it would be really common for me to boost our shadows up a bit, maybe even boost the exposure up a little bit. Bring our highlights down a touch. I'm not going to muck with texture clarity or dehaze, anything like that. As I said, basic corrections. And what I am going to do is show you guys everything's set to standard. I've got the sharpening set to the base settings that Lightroom normally do. I would normally tweak with that, but I'm just going to leave that. Noise reduction, everything is set to as it normally would be when you first bring something into Lightroom. And I've got lens corrections on, and that is because I'm shooting with that 14-35, and I want to leave it just as Canon would normally have the lens correction set up. Obviously, we turn that off and we'll get some vignetting and stuff in the corners. But let's leave it on because that's probably what's going to happen, which is going to increase noise in the corners. And I want to see how all that handles. So that's where we're at. I'm going to apply that to everything. Let's have a little look. What is going on here? We're getting very different handling of the white balance on the R5 Mark II compared to the R3 and the R5 that look almost exactly the same. I'm going to take my white balance measurements for those from this mouse. I'm going to take them all from the mouse. So they're going to be slightly different. I'll copy that to that set of images and I'll do the same for the other ones. So I do remember that being a weird thing with the first R5 and then Adobe kind of sorted it out. All right, now we should be good. So basically, we've got the R5 Mark II, R3, obviously not as much resolution, so when we go into 100%, it's not quite as close up. And then the original R5. I don't know, can you guys see any difference other than slight differences in white balance? They look super similar. Super similar at ISO 800. Let's try 1600. It's a classic sort of high ISO issues over here. You can see the lack of detail and noise even at 1600, because remember we have pushed this file just a bit with shadows. We pushed it a bit with exposure so that we could preserve those highlights. So this isn't bad at all considering what we've done to it. It's definitely more noise visible in the R5 Mark II again than the R3, but we're definitely going to have to equalize them out and check to see whether the extra detail and resolution is enough to make up for the extra noise when output at the same file size. Quick check over on the OG R5. Let's have a look at my keyboard, my dirty keyboard. New R5 Mark II versus OG R5. Maybe a slightly sharper shot. Slightly more detail at 1600. I don't know. It's very negligible. But yeah. And then R3, in terms of color, holds up beautifully. So do the R5s, both at this ISO. So again, not a big difference. Let's go to 3200, really commonly used for me and probably a lot of wedding photographers as well. Very commonly used ISO range for those higher ISO shots. All right. R5 Mark II. Yeah, look at this in the corners where it's obviously not just pushing. Yeah, that's that lens correction. Look at that. A lot of noise in the corners just due to us pushing the shadows. So if we take them away, a lot of noise in the corners from pushing the shadows. I obviously would not process this file like that, but it's good to see how it's going to handle it. I wonder whether it almost looks like less of those corrections are being applied on the R3, despite being at exactly the same profile. It might just be, I think it's handling the file being pushed a little bit better. Again, we'll have to compare the output files. Old R5 versus new R5 in the same corners. The new one looks a bit worse, but I don't trust comparing that stuff with the lens profiles corrected to come down to the, which one is better. Let's have a look at something away from the edges a little bit. Not a lot of difference. Maybe we need to go in a little bit closer. Let's go to 200%. You guys seeing much difference there? I'm not. Check these out. No real difference between the R5s. Check the R3. Definitely less noise. Zoom the R3 into 300%, just a little bit more. And then put the R5 to 200%. Can't really jump between the two, but what about colors? Just seems like the R3 is definitely cleaner in the shadows, but I think you could process the R5 file slightly differently, and achieve a similar look. I'm trying to keep it, the same, but it seems like having that same setting applied to both files is having a different effect. It's weird. We are definitely pixel peeping, or as Greg said on today's podcast, people pixing. And that just goes to show that all three of these cameras are pretty awesome, and it's not going to be a big issue which one you pick. So far, up to 3200, I think they're going to be totally fine. 6400, let's see. Just go straight to 200%. Now remember, this is 6400 pushed 0.75 of exposure with shadows increased. We are testing high ISO. We're not trying to do things perfectly. Ugh. Pretty gross up there. Oh yeah. Lot of noise around the corners from where it's tried to recover when we zoom into 100%. I'm really interested to see what these files look like output to a similar size and viewed at, say, 4,000 pixels on the long edge or something like that. Even the R3 in the corners looking noisy, probably looking like the R5 did at 3200. So maybe a full stop better when we haven't accounted for the fact that this file has less detail and is smaller. So once we account for that, we'll see. Check our keyboards out. Original R5 in the corners. Yep. Same kind of grossness that we're seeing from those lens corrections. Check our camera strap. Similar, but if anything, maybe a little bit worse on the R5 Mark II. I don't know. And the Rodecaster. So this is the R5 Mark I, R5 Mark II, R5 Mark I, R5 Mark II. Seems noisier to me. I don't know. Maybe we'll turn these profile corrections off here on both of them, just in case something weird is happening. Turn them off on the R3 as well. And we'll just steer clear of the edges. Just have a look at the Rodecaster R3. So this is the R5 Mark II at 6400 ISO with shadows pushed and exposure pushed. And then back to the OG R5. OG R5 seems to be slightly better. Don't you guys think? Actually, a lot better when you look there. Check that out. Colors on the remote. R5. R3. Now we're starting to lose the colors a little bit more on the R5 OG than the R3. And then check out the R5 Mark II. R5 OG, R5 Mark II, R3. Let's move to 12,800 and see what sort of disaster we're dealing with. I'm going to start with the R3 just because that is what, and I'm going to turn profile corrections off on everything. Let's just get rid of that issue on all three, even though it is something that we will use. But like I say, process them as needed. Once you're shooting into ISOs like this, you're going to try and do what you can to minimize noise. And I'm sure I'll get some comments saying you would just run them through a denoise software, but the point is to try and first see how they cope without any of that. So the R3 colors are still holding up very well. Definitely losing a lot of the detail over the side here. Plenty of noise, but certainly not too bad, especially once you zoom out and say, oh yeah, that's not bad. R5 Mark II still looks good zoomed out, you know. Colors are all still holding up. Yeah, noise. Look at it. Tons of it. Tons of noise. But to be expected. Let's go back in on the R3. That noise profile is there as well, but it looks better. More pleasing. And then, so that's the original R5. R5 Mark II. Original R5. R5 Mark II. Call me crazy, but the original R5 looks slightly better. I don't know. It's super close. Could be differences in what I was doing when I was shooting it or whatever. This unscientific test, but let's have a look over here. R5 Mark II. Original R5. Yeah, similar, but the R5 Mark II does look ever so slightly worse. All right. Now we've got 6 shots at 25,600. First ones. These are ones that, like, really at this, they should all be processed individually to see. But overall, R5 Mark II, R3, R5, send profile corrections off on the R5, profile corrections off on the R3, and off on the R5 Mark II. Wow. R5 Mark II. R5. R5 Mark II. Starting to get a lot of color noise and stuff coming in. the R5 Mark II actually looks better than the R5 Mark I. And then the R3, much better. Definitely much better. All right, now for the ones that we shot at 25,600 and we shot those with a higher exposure. I opened the shutter for longer, so it blew out our lights, but we're going to recover those. Can't recover them all, as you can see. Look at that. So we're going to recover them to where we can, which was, I think, 25. And then we're going to have a look and see how much better the camera handled those, not having to have the shadows pushed so much and the exposure pushed so much. Definitely handles it a ton better, obviously letting in way more light. And shows that 25,600 is actually usable if you don't have to push the shadows in post. It's often pushing the shadows and pushing the exposure a bit in post that makes things look essentially as bad as we saw in, well, let me compare it. Look at that. That's the difference that having to push a couple of stops, 2 stops in post makes. So as I said, this was a test to see how well the cameras can handle being manipulated, not a test of how good I can make higher ISO look. I could make these files look great if I was shooting and editing to the conditions. I wanted to expose, no worry about the pun. I wanted to expose the difference between the R3 and the R5 Mark II at high ISO. So now we're comparing both those files processed in a similar way, and you can see the R3 does seem to handle it way better. But I'm really interested to run those through an export, bring them back in, and see how they look. Okay, thanks guys for sticking with me through this long video. But it's fun to go through this process and to have you guys come through it with me. I've exported the files all at 6,000 pixels on the long edge, so there'll be 6,000 pixels by 4,002 pixels. So they'll all be the same size. They're all the same sizes as the R3 would normally output. I've turned the profile correction off to let the corners be a little less noisy so it doesn't look as bad. No sharpening, just that's it. The very basic corrections that we put on, that you guys saw me put on the raw files in Lightroom. R5 Mark II, R3, and then R5. Let's compare the R5 Mark II to the R3. R5 Mark II on the left, R3 on the right. Now, this is at ISO 1600, which you cannot see much difference at all. This is a really common working ISO. They both look fantastic. If anything, with these, I don't know, it's the R3 probably looks a little bit better and sharper, which is weird considering they're downsampled. The R5 Mark II is downsampled from a really high res. But either way, it's like, look, it basically doesn't matter. We are definitely peeping the pixels. And then let's compare, hang on. Let's compare the R5 Mark II on the left to the original R5, and yeah, I mean, basically identical. Let's go up to 3200. We are seeing some more noise in the corners now on the R5 Mark II. Definitely more noise. In the shadows compared to the R3. compared to the original R5. Let's have a look at the keyboard. Everything looks pretty close. And then get into the corners. Similar amounts of noise, similar noise patterns between those two cameras. I can't see much difference at all. 6400. Wow. Significant difference at 6400 between the R5 Mark II on the left and the R3 on the right. This is where I would definitely need to process the R5 Mark II differently. And I'm sure I could process it to look closer, like I said, but this is showing what's happening when you do exactly the same thing to both RAW files. You're getting a lot more noise. Not sure why that is, because it definitely looks like it's trying to amplify the shadows more in the R5 Mark II. Compare it. Make sure I haven't done something wrong. We'll compare it to the original R5 and see if they're similar in the corners. And they are. And again, if anything, the original R5 may be slightly better, I think. See that? Just slightly. 12,800 compared to the R3. R3 definitely showing a lot more noise now. Looks similar to the R5 at 6400. So yeah, there is that stop difference, I think, even when we've normalized the files to the same size. Big difference. Quick check against the original R5 on the right, the R5 Mark II on the left, looking very similar to me at that ISO. I would say basically the same. Okay, 25,600. I've got two sets of images in here. We have got the pushed images and the non-pushed images. The pushed images first because they looked horrendous. Look at that. But R3, R5, R3, R5 Mark II. We don't even need to look closely at these. These were pushed at 25,600, not pushed 5 stops like crazy YouTubers do, but just pushed with about plus 50 of the shadows and a plus 75 of exposure. I would never do that to this file. Like I say, please don't crush me in the comments for, oh, you've ruined them. This was on purpose. They're all processed the same. I wanted to see what happened. The R3 held up way better. Still very noisy, way better. So, you know, there's that. R5 Mark II, R3, original R5. Okay. And last but not least is the 25,600 not pushed as much. This is what happens when you leave the shadows at a more normal setting and you don't have to push the exposure. This is at 25,600, but letting 2 more stops of light into the sensor, which is why it's way less noisy. This is the R5 Mark II. This is the R3. It is significantly better. And this is the original R5. Let's do some comparisons. So I think this is probably the most important image set in comparison. R5 Mark II on the left, R3 on the right. More detail in the R3, cleaner, much more pleasing image, processed the same. So for those of you that are thinking you could change from your R3 to an R5 Mark II, get more megapixels with no penalty, because remember, I've downsized these R5 Mark II files to be exactly the same JPEG output. there is still a noise penalty for getting those extra megapixels and that cropping ability. It's not free. Look at the detail in the R3 at 25,600 on our strap sticker up the top there. Like, impressive. And now we will compare the OG R5 to the new R5 Mark II, R5 Mark II on the left, old R5 on the right. Looking pretty similar. Again, pretty impressive considering high megapixel, but both have similar noise profiles. Yeah. It is what it is.
All right, well now I need to set up and take a little photo that we can use for social media promotion of the Camera Life podcast. So I'm going to rearrange this a little bit. I've already started and put some lights back on it. I hope you guys have enjoyed today's video. It was long, and I know it was an unscientific test of the high ISO capabilities of the Canon R5 Mark II, but I think it's important to test things the way that they might get used, which is pushing files a little bit and comparing them side by side to see what differences there are, but then also to acknowledge that if we needed to, I could definitely process each file in a different way and maybe get a slightly closer result if I tweaked each file to suit from each camera. So take from it what you will. In my opinion, the R3, even when normalizing files to a similar size, the R3 is still a superior high ISO camera to the R5 Mark II. Which one's going to suit you better is going to depend if you need that higher megapixel cropping power more often, or if you need to shoot at 6400 and above regularly, then the R3 is always going to be better. At ISO 800 and 1600, don't really worry about it. And if you were thinking of upgrading from the R5 to the R5 Mark II specifically for high ISO, don't. That's not where the upgrades are in this camera. They're in the electronic shutter, they're in speed, they're in autofocus, they're in the video capabilities, but they're not in high ISO. So with that, time for me to get this shot set up and get it done so I can edit this video for you guys and post it today, because today is Thursday, the 29th of August, and if you've been following along at all, I'm filming and posting these videos the same day. So hopefully you're enjoying them, and let's take this photo and get it done. And I'm going to shoot this in 1:1, square natively, and then just need to find the right angle. I think that'll do. Going to be a one take wonder today.